Okay, so today we're diving into something really heavy, the 2019 Easter Sunday bombings in Sri Lanka. We've got a lot to unpack here. We're looking at an Al Jazeera report, kind of marking the fourth anniversary, and then this super detailed report from the Sri Lankan Parliament's Select Committee, the PSC. They investigated these attacks.
Yeah, it's a lot of information,
Yeah.
and you want to understand it, right? Cut through the noise, get to the heart of what happened.
Exactly. So we're going to be digging into that PSC report, zeroing in on like the big failures, the key takeaways about how this whole tragedy unfolded. Like, how do you even begin to process something like this? 4 years on, and Al Jazeera is reporting like people are still out there protesting, still demanding answers. What does that tell us about where things stand today?
I think it tells you that these bombings, they left a deep wound, these protests. Like people are saying, hey, we still have questions, we need accountability. It's like a sense that things haven't been fully addressed, you know?
For sure. And diving into this PSC report, one of the things that really hits you is like the sheer number of intelligence failures. They straight up say several people tried to warn these authorities. Complaints were filed, and nothing happened. What does that tell you about the system that was in place?
It's a huge red flag, right? You have all these warning signs, and they're just not being acted on. And the report, it goes even deeper, pointing out this lack of trust between agencies. The police and the Attorney General's Department, the AGD, they weren't working together.
So you've got these potential life-saving pieces of information, but the very people who are supposed to be acting on it, they're not even talking to each other.
Basically, they're operating in silos, and that's just incredibly dangerous, especially in a security context.
Mhm.
You need that communication, that collaboration. And when you don't have it, well, you see what can happen. It's a recipe for disaster.
The report also talks about the structure they had for intelligence, these intelligence coordinating meetings, the ICMs, held every Tuesday, right? But there was also a pre-meeting on Mondays.
Yeah, that's right. They tried to create a system. According to the director of the State Intelligence Service, the SIS, there were these Monday pre-meetings ordered by the Secretary of the Ministry of Defense, the MOD. The idea was to get everyone on the same page and make those Tuesday meetings more efficient.
Okay, so on paper, it sounds organized, but reading the report, the reality seems totally different. These meetings were all over the place, and sometimes they didn't even have agendas. They mention one specific meeting on April 2nd, 2019, just weeks before the attacks. It sounds like chaos.
Yeah, the system definitely wasn't working as intended. And the problems went all the way to the top. The National Security Council, the NSC, they had similar issues. Those meetings were also irregular. And there were even times when key people were left out. Like after October 2018, the Prime Minister and the State Minister of Defense weren't even included in these discussions.
Wow, so the people at the very top, the ones responsible for national security, they're not even in the room. That's crazy. And the director of the SIS, he was usually the one giving those intelligence briefings at the NSC meetings, right? So what kind of intel was actually being shared? Or maybe more importantly, what wasn't being shared?
Yeah, that's the million-dollar question.
Yeah.
The report goes into some specific examples of intel about Zoran. The guy who was behind these attacks, he was actually briefed on by Mr. Nalantha Jayawardene to the NSC back in 2018. But then later on, the SIS director, he testified to the PSC and said he might not have briefed them specifically on Zoran,
Wow.
and there's no record of any follow-up action.
So they knew about this guy, Zarin, but nobody did anything.
It seems that way. They had him on their radar, but it just didn't translate into action.
And then there's this really specific intelligence that came in right before the attacks. On April 20th, 2019, late in the afternoon, they get reliable information saying that Zaran and his group, they're planning something between 6 and 10 a.m. the next morning. They even mention a Methodist church in Colombo as a possible target. It's chilling how specific it is.
It's scary how precise that intel was. And then even closer to the attack, like 8:27 a.m. on April 21st, they get more information confirming all of this. And the report, it goes into the reaction to this intel. The SIS director, he calls the IGWP, the Deputy Inspector General of Police for the Western Province. And he admits he didn't follow protocol. He didn't inform his superiors first. Why would he do that?
That's a good question. It raises all sorts of red flags about what was going on within the intelligence agency. Was there some kind of pressure? Were they afraid to go through the proper channels? It really makes you wonder. Definitely concerning. And it gets worse. The Secretary of the Ministry of Defense, the MOD, this is the top civilian in charge of defense, right? He wasn't even told about this intel directly by the SIS director. He only found out through the CNI, the Chief of National Intelligence, way earlier on April 9th, and then again on the 17th after another explosion in Katankudi. That's a massive delay in getting this vital information to the people who needed to act on it.
Yeah, the breakdown in communication is just mind-boggling. And it wasn't just this one specific piece of intel. The report says that there was an open arrest warrant for Zahran from July 2018 issued by the Colombo Magistrates Court. And Interpol had even issued a blue notice for him. They tried to get Facebook involved, send them the warrant, but they got no response. So they're trying to catch this guy. But it seems like every effort was met with some kind of obstacle.
So roadblocks everywhere. The CID, the Criminal Investigation Department, they knew about Zahran too, like way back in January 2019. They even started investigating him after reports of meetings about extremism. But even with the CID on the case, it seems like that information wasn't shared effectively.
You hit the nail on the head. It wasn't a lack of information, it was a lack of communication. The SIS director, he didn't tell the DMI, the Directorate of Military Intelligence, until April 19th, 2019. That's more than 2 weeks after they first got that critical intel. And to top it all off, he admitted that he never sent any of this information to the MOD secretary in writing. No paper trail.
It's like they were deliberately trying to make it difficult to track what they knew and when they knew it. So we've talked about all these failures in intelligence, but the report, it also mentions this whole other thing, the rise of Buddhist extremism. Now, this isn't directly related to the Easter Sunday bombings, right? So why even bring it up?
It's a good question. I think the PSC wanted to paint a broader picture, to show that there were these other tensions in Sri Lanka, this climate of extremism, even if it wasn't directly linked to these specific attacks.
Yeah.
You know, it's about understanding the context.
So more like background information, not a direct cause.
Yeah, that's how I see it. But there's another part of the report that gets into the specifics of the ideology behind these attacks. They talk about the spread of Wahhabism and Arabization of Katankudi. Now, for people who might not be familiar with this, what exactly is Wahhabism? And why is it important in this context?
Yeah, could you break that down a little?
Sure. So Wahhabism, it's like a really strict conservative interpretation of Sunni Islam. It goes back to this guy, Muhammad ibn Abd al-Wahhab from the 18th century. They emphasize going back to the basics, a literal interpretation of the Quran and the Hadith. And they reject a lot of the later developments in Islamic thought.
Okay, so a very back to basics, literal approach to Islam. But how does that tie into these attacks?
Well, the thing about Wahhabism is it can create a very black and white worldview. It can be intolerant of other interpretations of Islam and sometimes even other religions. And the report, it points out that this kind of thinking, it contributed to the growth of extremism in Sri Lanka, especially in Katankudi.
So this town, Katankudi, it becomes kind of a breeding ground for this extremist ideology.
In a way, yes.
Yeah.
And the PSC report, it notes that a lot of the Wahhabis in Sri Lanka, they operate through these Tawheed movements. And Zahran's group, the NTJ, was one of those movements, so you can see the connection there.
Okay, so there's this ideological link between Wahhabism and the group that carried out the attacks. And it gets even more complicated because apparently there's also this history of conflict within the Muslim community in Katankudi. It's like going back to the 90s, there were reports of violence by Wahhabis against Sufi Muslims. It's like another layer of tension.
Yeah, it's a complex situation. In the report, it includes testimony from people who were directly involved, like the secretary of the Al-Hajj Abdulwad Ali Muwayyil Trust. He's a Sufi Malavi, and he talks about how some mosques in Katankudi, they were actually teaching Wahhabism. So you have this ideological clash going on, which creates an environment where extremism can flourish. And the report even mentions that the former Eastern Province governor, this guy, Mr. MLAM Hizbullah, he admitted that he played a role in these changes in Katankudi. So it wasn't just a religious issue. It was also tied to local politics.
Wow, so many different factors at play here. So we've got this specific religious ideology, this history of internal conflict. And then on top of that, all these intelligence failures. But the crazy thing is, it's not like Zahran just came out of nowhere. There were so many warnings about him. The report is full of them. Like, people were raising concerns about Zahran and his extremist views going back to, like, 2013, 2014. Residents of Katankudi, local Muslim groups, former Governor Azaf Sali, he even told the defense secretary at the time, Gotabaya Rajapaksa, about the NTJ and the threat they posed. And the ACJU, the Al Ceylon Jama'ath ul Ulama, they'd been warning the government about extremists since 2014. It's mind-blowing how many red flags there were.
Right. It's like nobody was listening. And these weren't just vague concerns either. Sufi Muslims in Kitankuni, they were complaining about harassment from Zahra and his followers starting in 2015. And get this, in 2017, the TID, the Terrorism Investigation Division, they actually asked to ban the NTJ. But it never happened. They knew this group was dangerous, but nothing was done.
It's like they were asleep at the wheel. The TID even filed a B report against Zahran, a preliminary investigation report. So they're definitely aware of him. And it wasn't just law enforcement. Ahaj Abdul Jalab Alim Vayula Trust, those Sufi Muslims we talked about, they sent a letter directly to the Attorney General in April 2017, asking him to open a file on Zahran to investigate his activities. And the Prime Minister's office, they even got a similar letter on the same time. And to make matters even worse, the OIC at the Kitankuni police station, he sent a detailed letter to the AG's department in November 2017, full of information about Zahran's extremist activities. But the initial request for an investigation from the AG's department, it was completely ignored by the IGP, the Inspector General of Police. It's just unbelievable how many warnings they had.
It really is. The evidence was piling up, but it seems like nobody wanted to connect the dots. And, the report also talks about Zahran's own path to radicalization. And there's this event in March 2018, the attacks on Muslims in Digana. That seems to be a turning point for him. Like after that, he really ramps up his efforts to radicalize Muslim youth, to push them towards violence. And his social media activity, it explodes with extremist content.
So this attack on Muslims actually ends up fueling more extremism.
Tragically, yes. It's like a vicious cycle. And the report, it points out that Zahran, he was giving these public speeches in Kitankuni in 2016 and 2017. And he wasn't hiding his hatred. He openly preached against non-Muslims. Even the dead, they should be killed. And nobody stopped him.
It's like they were giving him a platform. And the report goes into detail about the kind of training Zahran was providing. It wasn't just speeches, it was actual weapons training, teaching people how to kill. And the TID, they were monitoring all of this. They knew about his videos, his online propaganda, his ties to ISIS. But they didn't do anything to stop him.
It's a terrifying example of how these extremist groups operate, how they recruit and train people. And then in 2017, there's this incident where Zahran actually gets into a fight with the local Sufi community and then disappears. They issue an arrest warrant for him, but he's gone. And here's a chilling detail. Two of the guys who were arrested in that 2017 incident, they ended up becoming suicide bombers on Easter Sunday. So you can see how these events are all connected.
It's like a domino effect.
No.
And then in December 2018, they find this massive stash of explosives in Wanathawalu. After Zahran's group destroys some Buddhist statues, that should have been a wake-up call.
You would think so, right. They had evidence of his violence, his extremist ideology, and now they find a huge stockpile of explosives. It's like all the pieces were there, but nobody put them together.
Now, the report doesn't just focus on the operational failures, the intelligence stuff. It also goes after the political leadership. They're pretty critical of the president at the time, saying he failed to provide leadership, that he undermined government systems, and they point to those irregular NSC meetings as evidence of that.
Right, they don't hold back. They even mention that the president, he left the country on April 16th, 2019, just days before the attacks, and he didn't even appoint an acting minister for defense. So you have this leadership vacuum at a critical moment. And then there's this decision he made in 2018 to put the police under the control of the Minister for Defense. The PSC, they see that as a violation of the 19th Amendment, like he was trying to consolidate power.
So not only is he absent, but he's also messing with the system. And then there's the fact that the Prime Minister and the State Minister for Defense, they weren't even invited to those NSC meetings after October 2018. That seems like a deliberate attempt to exclude them from important security discussions.
It does, doesn't it? And then the report mentions that the position of Secretary of the MOD, it changed hands 5 times during this government's term. That's a lot of turnover, a lot of instability.
Right.
And on top of all that, you have politicians making inflammatory comments after the attacks, which just makes the situation worse.
Yeah, it's like they were pouring gasoline on the fire. And the report also mentions these rumors about politicians and intelligence officials supporting Zahran, like maybe they were protecting him or turning a blind eye to his activities.
That's one of the most disturbing aspects of all of this.
Right.
If there was any truth to those rumors, it would mean that the people who were supposed to be protecting Sri Lanka were actually helping the terrorists. It's a really dark thought.
And the report keeps coming back to this issue of communication. Or rather, the lack of communication, this massive setback, they call it, this total lack of trust and coordination between intelligence agencies and law enforcement.
Yeah, It's a recurring theme. It's like they were all working in their own little bubbles and nobody was sharing information. Even when they had crucial pieces of the puzzle, they couldn't see the bigger picture because they weren't talking to each other.
And if you zoom out a bit, the report also talks about the broader context of Islamic extremism in Sri Lanka, how it's been growing over the past few decades, especially in the eastern province. And they say that the intelligence community, they knew about this trend, but they didn't do enough to counter it. And we've already talked about the role of Wahhabism in this. It's like a perfect storm of factors.
It's a complex web of factors.
Yeah.
And then the report brings up another sensitive issue, the marginalization of the Muslim community in Sri Lanka and the rise of Islamophobia after the Civil War. They're not saying that this caused the bombings, but they're suggesting that it created an environment where extremism could thrive.
So it's like a breeding ground. The report points to these past anti-Muslim riots like in Mawanela in 2001, Oluthgama in 2014, Jintoda in 2017, Ampara and Digana in 2018, and then there was another one in the northwestern province in May 2019. And they note that nobody was really held accountable for these attacks. So you have this sense of injustice, of impunity.
Right. And that kind of environment can be really dangerous. It can push people towards extremism, especially young people who are looking for answers, who are feeling angry and disenfranchised. And the report, it also talks about this broader climate of fear and suspicion towards Muslims, fueled by these anxieties about population growth, economic competition, and all of that.
So it's like a mix of internal factors within the Muslim community and these external pressures from society at large. A really toxic mix. And in the end, the report comes to this really stark conclusion. They say that several individuals failed in their duties, that there needs to be more investigation, maybe even indictments and prosecutions. And they specifically call out the president and the state minister for defense.
Yeah, they place the blame squarely on the shoulders of the leadership. They're saying that these failures at the top contributed directly to this tragedy.
So this deep dive into the PSC report, it's been a tough one. We've seen intelligence failures, a lack of coordination, a failure to act on warnings. We've seen the influence of extremist ideology, both religious and political, and ultimately a failure of leadership at the highest level. It's a really sobering look at how these kinds of events can happen.
It is, and it's a reminder that these problems, they're not unique to Sri Lanka. They can happen anywhere.
Exactly. So for you listening, we want to leave you with this thought. We've seen how all these different failures at different levels contributed to this tragedy. What do you think are the most important changes we need to make, not just in Sri Lanka, but globally, to prevent something like this from happening again? What's our responsibility as individuals, as societies, to hold people accountable and to fight against extremism?
It's a tough question, but it's one we all need to think about. And we encourage you to dig deeper into this report to really understand the complexities of this issue.
Yeah.
Because it's not going away anytime soon.
It's a conversation we need to keep having.
Absolutely.